So most of you guys probably remember this. This is an RX 590, which was basically just a factory overclocked RX 580, which itself was basically just a factory overclocked RX 480. Well, AMD has done it again. Say hello to the new RX 6X50 series. Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out AMD's refreshed RX 6950 XT, 6750 XT, and 6650 XT. We're not looking at the reference designs, however, as Sapphire has actually sent us their Nitro Plus models for the 6650 and the 6750, while for the 6950 we actually have the brand new Nitro Plus Pure. At this point, if you're sat there wondering exactly what this series of 6X50 graphics cards are, it is pretty straightforward. AMD has simply refreshed the 6900 XT, the 6700 XT, and the 6600 XT GPUs, giving them higher clock speed and faster memory modules. Both the 6950 XT and 6750 XT have new 18 gigabit per second memory, while the 6650 XT has 17.5 gigabits per second VRAM. Of course, that extra clock speed and faster memory does result in a bump to power draw, but otherwise the GPUs are identical. Core count, the 7nm process, ray tracing hardware, all is identical. It really is just faster GPU and memory speeds. As we move on to talk about performance then, one thing I do want to point out right from the off is that I am testing Sapphire's Nitro Plus series of cards. So these all come with pretty decent factory overclocks, even higher than the figures you saw on that previous table. All the other graphics cards I tested, apart from the MSI 3090 Ti Supreme X, were benchmarked at reference clock speeds though, so that does mean it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, so that's just something I wanted to point out right from the beginning of this video. As usual though, all of our testing was done with our regular GPU test system powered by MSI. This is built on Intel's i9-12900K CPU, and that is paired with the MSI Z690 Unify motherboard with 32GB of ADATA XPG DDR5 memory clocked at 6000 MHz. We're also using the MSI MPG 321URQD 4K monitor. The only other thing to mention at this point in the video is that all three 6X50 series cards you are going to see today, they were all benchmarked with the Adrenalin 22.10 driver, which AMD supplied to press for this review. But with that out of the way, let's get into the benchmarks. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is our first game to look at today, starting at 1080p. Here we can see that the RX 6650 XT is averaging 93 FPS, and that makes it 5% faster than the original RX 6600 XT. The RX 6750 XT is 7% faster than the vanilla 6700 XT, this time averaging just under 118 FPS, which is actually not far at all away from the RX 6800. The RX 6950 XT, meanwhile, breaks past 150 FPS, delivering 7% more performance than the original RX 6900 XT. Up at 1440p, the margins don't actually change for either the 6650 XT or the 6750 XT, as both models are still 5 and 7% faster respectively when compared to the original versions. And I'd say that's fine, but it's no great shakes. The RX 6950 XT, however, now sees a 10% boost over the 6900 XT, but do remember this is the factory overclocked Nitro Plus model, whereas we tested the original reference 6900. As for 4K, the 6950 XT is now actually 12% faster than the RX 6900 XT, and it beats out even the RTX 3090 Ti Supreme X. The RX 6650 and 6750 XT are a little bit more muted with their performance gains, however, with both cards just a couple of FPS ahead of their original versions. As for Cyberpunk 2077, here we do actually see some bigger performance improvements from the new AMD GPUs. At 1080p, the RX 6650 XT delivers an 8% uplift in performance when compared to the 6600 XT, while the 6750 XT is now 10% faster than the reference 6700. Those trends stay very consistent as we step up to 1440p as well. The 6650 XT does start to struggle a bit more at this resolution, but it is still 7% ahead of the 6600 XT. Meanwhile, the 6750 XT delivers a solid 56 FPS on average, while the 6950 XT is neck and neck with the RTX 3090 Ti at the top of the chart. Up at 4K then as well, we can see similar performance improvements from both the 6650 and 6750, however both are still well below 30 FPS and definitely are not suited to this resolution. The RX 6950 XT is once more 12% faster than the RX 6900 XT, but it does fall short of the RTX 3090 Ti, just squeaking in ahead of the vanilla RTX 3090. Next up is Far Cry 6, and this title is slightly less impressive for the new GPUs. At 1080p, we can definitely see a good case of CPU bottlenecking, as the top 3 GPUs on the chart are all clustered very close together. The 6650 XT is just 5% faster than the 6600 XT though, while we can see a 7% boost from the 6750 XT when compared to the vanilla 6700 XT. As for 1440p, thankfully we are much more GPU limited at this resolution, and the 6950 XT is now actually 11% faster than the 6900 XT, which is much more like it. Both the 6650 XT and 6750 XT see similar performance uplifts to what we saw at 1080p, with each gaining a handful of frames compared to their original models. Stepping up once more in resolution then, although it's not designed for 4K gaming, the 6750 XT can actually do a job here in Far Cry 6, though it is pipped to the post by the RTX 3070. The RX 6950 XT remains at the top of the chart though, but do remember this is an AMD sponsored title and performance definitely favours Team Red. Moving on to Red Dead Redemption 2 now, this is actually one of the better games for the RX 6X50 series of cards. At 1080p for instance, we are looking at an 8% performance improvement for the RX 6650 XT when compared against the 6600 XT, and we can also see that the 6750 XT is 7% ahead of the 6700 XT. Up at 1440p as well, the performance trends are very similar, as we can see small but not insignificant gains from all 3 of the new GPUs when comparing them to their predecessors. The 6950 XT is still just about faster than the RTX 3090 Ti as well, but only by a couple of frames. And then coming to 4K, this is too much for the 6650 XT to handle, but the 6750 XT still puts in a good shift, and is only just slower than the RTX 3070. Sapphire 6950 XT does also fall behind the RTX 3090 Ti, but that is to be expected at this resolution. Closing out with Total War Warhammer 3. By now you have got the picture. The RX 6650 XT sees a 7% performance lead over the 6600 XT at 1080p, while the 6750 XT is 9% faster than the 6700 XT. Most impressive though is the RX 6950 XT, which sees almost a 15% performance bump over the 6900 XT, but it is still short of the RTX 3090 Ti. Meanwhile, at 1440p, those performance differentials are almost exactly the same. The 6950 XT does drop off a bit more however, now coming in short of the RTX 3080 Ti, and the 6750 XT is beaten by the RTX 3060 Ti, though do remember this game does have a preference for Nvidia GPUs. Lastly, at 4K, only the 6950 XT manages playable frame rates, but it still can't match even the RTX 3080 10GB, but it is coming in 13% faster than the 6900 XT. That's going to do it for our individual game benchmarks then, as once you've seen a couple, you've really seen them all. But I did still test 12 games overall, so let's go ahead and look at average performance. Averaged across all 12 games then at 1080p, the Sapphire RX 6650 XT Nitro Plus ran 6% faster than the RX 6600 XT, while the 6750 XT proved 8% faster than the 6700 XT. The big dog, the RX 6950 XT, ran 9% faster than the vanilla 6900 XT, which isn't too shabby. Up at 1440p, both the 6650 XT and 6750 XT scale exactly the same as they do at 1080p, so we're talking gains of 6 and 8% respectively. The RX 6950 XT is more impressive though, delivering an extra 11% performance when compared to the RX 6900 XT. And then at 4K, once more we can see a 6% performance boost for the 6650 XT when compared to the 6600 XT, while the 6750 XT is also still 8% faster than the vanilla RX 6700 XT. At its very best, the RX 6950 XT delivers 12% more performance than AMD's previous flagship, the RX 6900 XT. When looking at those figures as well, it is just worth reiterating that this is actually a best case scenario for the 6x50 series, as I am testing the Sapphire Nitro Plus series of cards, which all come heavily factory overclocked. Take the 6950 XT Nitro Plus Pure for instance, that actually has an 11% clock speed increase compared to the reference 6950 XT. So if I was testing reference against reference, which ideally would be the case, then I would expect smaller margins than what I saw here. Just before finishing up with the game benchmarks though, I do also want to quickly touch on ray tracing performance, but we're not going to go into loads of detail. The reason for that is that the only change for these new GPUs is extra clock and memory speed. There's no extra RT cores or anything like that, so ray tracing performance scales just the same as all the other games we looked at today, and honestly it's really not going to change much. Nvidia still has the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing. All these new cards are doing is just closing the gap ever so slightly. At this point in the review though, it is time to shake things up a bit, so we're going to take a closer look at all three of the Sapphire cards we have reviewed today, before coming on to look at things like thermals, noise and power draw. There's only one place to start, and that is with the RX 6950 XT Nitro Plus Pure. As you will have seen, this is sporting a new white shroud, and it really is a beautiful looking card. It is still clearly a Nitro Plus design, but the white metal shroud and clean backplate really do look the part. Being a triple fan setup though, it is very large, with full triple slot thickness, and it weighs over 1.5 kilos on my scales. We can also note a dual BIOS switch, and power connectors consist of 2 8-pins and 1 6-pin. As for the RX 6750 XT Nitro Plus, as far as I can tell, this is the same design as the regular 6700 XT Nitro Plus that I reviewed last year. That's no bad thing though, as it still looks very clean and it has a triple fan cooler, plus you get a full length silver backplate, and that is made from metal. Chuck in the dual BIOS support as well, and 2 8-pins for power, and overall it is a very tidy looking piece of work. The last thing worth mentioning though is that it is still pretty large, and it weighs in at 1.16 kilos. Much the same can also be said for the Nitro Plus 6650 XT. It does look broadly similar to the 6750 XT, but the key difference being that it is a smaller dual fan design, and it weighs in at less than 850 grams. It is still on the chunky side though, as it's approaching a triple slot thickness, but you do still get that full length metal backplate and dual BIOS switch as well, so it's not lacking in features despite its size. Sapphire has also done well to keep power requirements at just a single 8-pin, so that's not actually increased compared to the RX 6600 XT. Diving back into our testing then, we're going to start off with the card's operating frequency, where we put both BIOS modes for each of the cards to the test. We can clearly see some big increases in clock speed compared to the original RX 6000 series of cards. The Nitro Plus 6650 XT is over 200 MHz faster than its predecessor, while the 6750 XT is about 180 MHz faster. Even the 6950 XT comes in with over a 230 MHz clock speed advantage when compared to the original 6900 XT, which is honestly quite impressive considering it has the largest core count of any RDNA 2 GPU. Moving on to thermals then, these Sapphire Nitro Plus models do perform very well. As we'd expect, the 6950 XT does run the hottest as it has the highest power target, but the GPU edge temperature still remained below 80 degrees. The 6650 XT and 6750 XT are even more impressive though, keeping the edge temperature below 70 degrees in the case of the 6650 XT, while even the silent BIOS on the 6750 XT is only peaking at just over 70°C. That being said, the sheer lack of noise is easily the most impressive thing about these Sapphire cards. Regardless of which card or BIOS mode was used, the fans were barely audible, and I actually had to press my ear right up against the cards to double check that the fans were even spinning. It's also worth noting that 32 decibels is actually the noise floor in my testing environment, which just goes to show how little noise these cards actually make, that my sound meter could not distinguish a difference between the fan spinning or sitting idle. It really is highly impressive stuff, especially when considering the fact that the thermals don't suffer as a result of these low noise levels. As for power draw then, we're going to start off by taking a look at power draw of just the graphics card. So this is not total system power draw, and we can do this thanks to Nvidia's PCAT tool. The results you're about to see as well are averaged over all 12 games we have tested. As we can see, the increase in clock and memory speed does necessitate an increase to power draw. Sapphire has actually raised power targets even further than the reference figures however, but we can still see some significant jumps at 1080p. The 6950 XT draws over 70 watts more than the 6900 XT, while the 6750 XT is pulling another 40 watts compared to the 6700 XT. Power draw figures get even higher at 1440p as well, with the 6950 XT now approaching 400 watts, and that's not far at all from a 100 watt increase compared to the original 6900 XT. The 6750 XT meanwhile is pulling 266 watts, and that's still over a 40 watt increase compared to the 6700 XT, while the 6650 XT pulls just over 170 watts. And then as for 4K, power draw does indeed hit over 400 watts for the RX 6950 XT, though the other two cards we tested are not drawing much more power than they did at 1440p. Still, we are looking at some very sizable power increases for the 6X50 series when compared to the original models. Such large increases in power draw, despite fairly insignificant performance improvements, does mean that the performance per watt efficiency of all three models is well below that of the original RX 6000 series cards. The 6650 XT, for instance, is actually 10% less efficient than the vanilla RX 6600 XT at 1080p. The same can also be said at 1440p. The original 6900 XT is one of the most efficient GPUs on the market, but Sapphire's 6950 XT Nitro Plus is about 17% less efficient in terms of performance per watt. And then at 4K, we can see that the RX 6950 XT Nitro Plus is now 19% less efficient than the original RX 6900 XT. That really is the price you pay to push clock speeds that bit higher, as we quickly run in. The last thing to touch on then is going to be manual overclocking, where frankly we actually did a bit better than I was expecting. Starting off with the 6650 XT, here we could push the GPU up to 3010 MHz, with the memory coming in at 2380 MHz. Weirdly though, the 6750 XT is much more limited, as AMD has actually restricted the overclocking sliders. The GPU slider maxes out at 2950 MHz, while the memory maxed out at 2312 MHz. I can only think this is to avoid an overclocked 6950 XT getting too close to an RX 6800, but it's pretty lame whatever the reason. And then for the 6950 XT, here the sliders are not capped, and we managed to get 2845 MHz on the GPU and 2390 MHz to the memory. All three of those overclocks resulted in pretty sizable increases to the average clock speed of the cards in question, though I'd say most impressive is the 6950 XT, which ran almost 300 MHz faster than it did out of the box. These overclocks also saw pretty similarly sized performance gains as well, where we are typically looking at an extra 5 to 8% depending on the game tested. Again, it's not absolutely massive, but it's not nothing either, and to be honest with you, I was actually slightly surprised there was even this much headroom left, though of course this will vary from card to card. So that is pretty much it for this review, and to be honest with you guys, it is a very simple one. All we've got from the RX 6X50 series is an increase to clock speed and memory frequency, with no other changes to anything like the core count, ray tracing hardware, or anything like that. Because of that, I don't think anyone was expecting massive performance gains, because that's certainly not what we got. The numbers shown in this review are even slightly skewed because I was testing heavily factory overclock models compared to reference cards, but even then, this is hardly a performance revolution. Now, that doesn't mean that the 6X50 series is good or bad, it just means that it basically all comes down to pricing. AMD told us that the 6650 XT is going to directly replace the original 6600 XT, but the 6750 XT and the 6950 XT are going to coexist with their original models. Unfortunately, that basically means how good these cards are is all going to come down to pricing, and based on what we've been told, it doesn't sound like it's going to be good news. The original RX 6700 XT, for instance, can be found for £500 on OC UK right now. OC UK also told us that the Sapphire Pulse 6750 XT, so that's not even the Nitro Plus model that we looked at in this video. The Pulse 6750 XT is going to be priced at £599, so that's basically a 20% increase for the 6750 XT over the 6700 XT, and that just does not add up based on the performance we have seen. Pretty simply then, my advice to you is this: if you are in the market for one of these new cards and they're priced within 5% or so when compared to the original versions, then you may as well go for it. If there is going to be a bigger price premium though, in the 10, 15, even 20% region as we are hearing, then to me it's just not worth thinking about, as the price increase does not reflect the performance boost you are getting. That being said, I do want to finish on a positive note, and that is about the Sapphire Nitro Plus cards that we looked at today, as they are all excellent designs. Not just the fact that Sapphire has actually clocked them pretty aggressively out of the box, but they are so quiet while also running nice and cool. Plus, I also love the new Nitro Plus pure white design, so I really hope that one sticks around for future generations. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts on this new 6X50 series down in the comments below. You can hit that subscribe button and ding that notification bell if you haven't already, and why not come chat with us on our Discord server, which is linked in the description below. While you're there, you can also find a link to our merch store, and if you're feeling particularly generous, you can even consider backing us on Patreon. That is it for this one though guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.